Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Will Tolliver Jr. I'm an early learning expert and a PBS KIDS early learning champion based out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Today, I'll be your moderator and guide in this conversation. Thank you for joining us. This event is designed for parents and designed to help you take direct action, talking with your kids about race and racism. This conversation may be heavy and uncomfortable for some people. So I want to set some community guidelines to make sure our conversation is meaningful for all. On your screen, you'll see the guidelines that we have. First, racism will not be tolerated. You will immediately be blocked. Next, we ask that you please model empathy. Remember that we're all coming from different entry points to this conversation. We are all experts of our own experiences and our own parenting styles and approaches. Please focus your time here on your own learning. With that, we need to remember that we are all learning. It's okay to not know, and we will not judge you for not knowing. And finally, please be open to new ideas. I need to convey the importance of following these guidelines. If you do not follow these guidelines, you will be blocked from the chat immediately. Now, to start this event off, I would like to take a moment to say that Black Lives Matter. George Floyd matters. Breonna Taylor matters. Philando Castile matters. Michael Brown matters. Tony McDade matters. Sandra Bland matters. Trayvon Martin matters. Eric Garner matters. Tamir Rice matters. All the named and unnamed Black lives that have been taken and slain matter. Black Lives Matter. I now want to ask you and my presenters to take a moment of silence to honor, acknowledge, and respect the Black lives that have been lost. As a media system, PBS serves every person in America. We stand with the Black community and we stand against racism and hate. We are committed to using our national reach and community presence to deepen understanding, foster conversation, and enable meaningful change. And that is what this event is about. On the right hand of your screen, you will see the chat box, which allows you to introduce yourself, post comments, and submit questions for a panelist or myself. Throughout this event, we'll do our best to integrate your questions into our conversation. When you're posting a comment, please include your name. And within the chat box, you can change your view from live chat to top chat or vice versa. We recommend live chat because live chat helps you see what everyone is posting in real time. So if anything comes to mind in our conversation, please utilize that chat box. And be sure to be on the lookout for resources from our friends at PBS that they'll be posting in the chat as well. I want to take a moment to let you know, if you're joining us today and you did not register for this event, please do so now. My friends from PBS will be dropping the link into the chat. Use that link to register so that we can send you this recording and the resources that we'll be discussing today. It's also important to note that for my educators out there, you will not be receiving credit for this event. You can be on the lookout for an event specifically designed for educators later this month. Now, I'm delighted and so happy to introduce you to three colleagues of mine that will offer their expertise around our conversation today. First, I'd like to welcome Jamal Berry. Jamal is a fellow PBS KIDS Early Learning Champion and is the Deputy Director of Educare DC, which is a nationally accredited childcare provider. Jamal, welcome.
Thank you, Will, and thank you everybody for joining today. So I just want to share that I feel frustrated and concerned about what George Floyd's murder has reminded us of. Being a Black man in America means that I'm always having to prove myself, whether it's professionally or at a simple traffic stop. For my safety, I have to be concerned of how I make other people feel. Recent events have given all of us an opportunity, everybody on this webinar and in America. Together, we can look at the current systems that are in place and view them with an honest lens. It is my hope that people of all backgrounds will see the value that I see in Black men and in Black lives. And so thank you all for having me today to discuss such an important topic.
Thank you, Jamal. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Dana Winters. Dr. Winters is the Director of Simple Interactions and Faculty Director of Academic Programs at the Fred Rogers Center for Early Learning and Children's Media. Welcome.
Thank you, Will. Thank you so much for having me today. And I want to thank Jamal and Dr. Wilson Simmons for your guidance and leadership in this event. Through a lot of the work that I've done, I've seen firsthand how interactions have the power to be either humanizing or dehumanizing. And I think over the last few weeks in particular, we've all witnessed, and maybe some of us for the first time, many of us not for the first time, begun to understand the dehumanizing experiences that Black communities have lived through for hundreds of years. And it's time now for us to take a stand, to fight against that dehumanization. And it takes commitment from each and every one of us in big and small ways. And for us as parents, it means talking about this so that the next generation isn't having interactions that dehumanize others, that we are fighting together, committed to learning and listening, to engaging and sharing our histories, to promoting humanizing interactions, and to building generations of people in our future who can open and not fear these conversations and can truly fight against the injustices that we have been seeing, especially these last few weeks. So thank you so much for having me here. I look forward to being a part of this for the next hour.
Thank you. And lastly, we have Dr. Renee Wilson Simmons. Dr. Simmons is a child and adolescent development expert and the head of Adverse Childhood Experience Foundation based in Memphis, Tennessee. Welcome, Dr. Wilson Simmons.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate being here. So as Will said, I am Executive Director of the Adverse Childhood Experience Awareness Foundation. Now, I know that's a mouthful. And so for those folks who aren't familiar with the term Adverse Childhood Experiences, also called ACEs, we're talking about potentially traumatic events that are witnessed or experienced by children that have the potential to really lead to, I'm so sorry, have the potential to lead to negative outcomes, both emotional and physical throughout their life. And because we understand that the brain, the most of the brain is built from birth to age 3, that we really know that we have to work the clay while it's still wet. And that's an African proverb, or to be more specific, a Tanzanian proverb. And so because we know that, and we understand that early life experiences really shape the way the brain is built, the way the brain is formed. And so our universal parenting places, and there are 4 of them in Memphis, really work with parents who are working to support and build the brains of their children, that are working on building that clay. And so I would hope to have an opportunity to talk a bit more about working the clay while it's still wet, because it's imperative.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us. And Dr. Wilson Simmons, our conversations have really led us to this. I want to share a clip to start this conversation. This clip was inspired by something you said, and we'll get into that a little bit after. So let's take a look.
Of 1968.
On the day after Martin Luther King was killed,
one of my students came into the room and said, "They shot a king last night, Mrs. Elliott. Why'd they shoot that king?" I knew the night before that it was time to deal with this in a concrete way, not just talk about it, because we had talked about racism since the first day of school. But the shooting of Martin Luther King, who had been one of our heroes of the month in February, could not just be talked about and explained away. There was no way to explain this to little third graders in Riceville, Iowa. As I listened to the white male commentators on TV the night before, I was hearing things like, "Who's going to hold your people together?" as they interviewed black leaders. What are they going to do? Who's going to control your people? As though these people were subhuman and someone was going to have to step in there and control them. They said things like, "When we lost our leader, his widow helped to hold us together. Who's going to hold them together?" And the attitude was so arrogant and so condescending and so ungodly that I thought, if white male adults react this way, what are my third graders going to do? How are they going to react to this thing? I was ironing the teepee. We studied an Indian unit. We made a teepee every year. The first year, the students would make the teepee out of pieces of sheet. We'd sew it together. And the next year, we'd decorate it with Indian symbols. I was ironing the previous year's teepee, getting it ready to be decorated the next day. And I thought of what we had done with the Indians. We haven't made much progress in these 200, 300 years. And I thought, this is the time now to teach them really what the Sioux Indian prayer that says, "O Great Spirit, keep me from ever judging a man until I have walked in his moccasins," really means. And for the next day, I knew that my children were going to walk in someone else's moccasins for a day. Like it or lump it, they were going to have to walk in someone else's moccasins. I decided at that point that it was time to try the eye color thing, which I had thought about many, many times, but had never used. So the next day, I introduced an eye color exercise in my classroom and split the class according to eye color, and immediately created a microcosm of society in a third grade classroom.
Such a powerful clip from Frontline featuring Jane Elliott. And Dr. Wilson Simmons, you spoke about working the clay while it's still wet. So in connection to this clip, can you tell us a little bit more about what you mean?
So absolutely, I really see a monumental need for the kind of trailblazing and forward-thinking and anti-racist teacher that Jane Elliott was. And she was committed to working the clay while at least a portion of it was still wet, because these were third graders. And we know that at second and third grade, that's the time when young people start understanding more complicated issues like cause and effect. They start getting better at using language to express emotions and ideas. They tend to be more easily influenced by their peers. And so let me summarize what that teacher did. So she asked her all-white class of third graders to raise their hand if they had blue eyes. And then she asked the students to raise their hand if they had brown eyes. And then she told the class that the blue-eyed students, and she was also blue-eyed, that the blue-eyed students were the smart ones. They were the good ones. And the brown-eyed students were the opposite in all that's good and all that's smart. And she made fabric collars, and maybe out of some of that TP material, she made these fabric collars, and she had the blue-eyed third graders put the collars on the brown-eyed students. And then there were a bunch of other rules because they needed to be recognized wherever they were. And there were a bunch of other rules that they couldn't play with the blue-eyed students couldn't play with the brown-eyed students during recess. And so that day on the playground, there was teasing and name calling and fights and tears. There was a lot of crying, and the disruptions continued when the third graders returned to the classroom, and it included poor academic performance by students who had just the day before been doing good work. And then the next day, the teacher switched up her story, and she told them that what she said yesterday wasn't true, and that the brown-eyed students were the good ones and the smart ones. And then she had the brown-eyed students take those collars off and put it on the necks of the blue-eyed students. And obviously, there's much more to the story, but I think you get the point. And I'm guessing that some of you are appalled right now. But I would just say that I've seen this in its entirety many times, and I would highly recommend it to folks because I see something new and I learn something different each time. And just remember, this was done immediately after the death of Dr. Martin Luther King. So we're talking about something that happened 52 years ago. So, but in terms of, so you can make your own judgment when you see it, but, and the teacher repeated the exercise many times over the years, but she had that specific class come back as young adults. And those young adults talked about the difference that made in the way they thought about people, their perspectives, their attitudes. And so I believe that we need many more teachers like Jane Elliott, so that, and if we had many more then, we'd be in a better place now, but we're not in that better place. So what we need to do is to look at the kind of sort of revolutionary strategies that are needed to make change.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And I think it's so important, you know, having those students come back later and tell of that experience that they had is so powerful. And I think that's why we need to start talking to children at a younger age, younger than 3, while working the clay while it's still wet. And so, Jamal, I have a question for you. As a parent, what approaches are you taking to talk to your kids or prepare yourself to talk to your kids about Black lives and racism in America?
Yeah, so I think it's important to start out first acknowledging that in a lot of our African American families, and especially in mine, I think we look up to the matriarch. And so my mother, who's from North Carolina, talked a lot about what happened to her when she was young in the civil rights movement. She talked to me about even having to pick cotton at a young age. My mother-in-law, who was a history major at Howard University, also was a part of the civil rights movement. And so when our children, the grandchildren of my mother-in-law, go into first grade, she actually starts to teach them about Black history. And so they go to her and we talk about what's important. We talk about self-confidence. And my daughter, who is now 6, actually just recently studied 6 African-American women, from Misty Copeland to Ruby Bridges to Mae Jameson to Harriet Tubman. And last, she finished off with Sojourner Truth. And her last part of what she had to do, she recited Sojourner Truth's famous speech, "Ain't I a Woman from Memory," right? And so we're instilling history into them. We're talking to them about what their ancestors and what African Americans had to go through, and also the success stories that come along with that. And it carries over to the dinner table. So I think when I think about strategies, I think about family style dining is something that in early childhood we love to sit around the table and to be able to have conversations, and not just about the color of food or what foods look like, but about what happened today and what was your experience, right? And so my kids ask me about what I did at work and who I might have helped and what conversations I had. And I asked them about what they did during the day. And we use this opportunity to then talk about the implications of being Black. We use this to dialogue about current events and then to give them the opportunity to express themselves and talk. And so I think that's the biggest thing, is to have honest conversations and to use historical facts when talking to young kids.
Thank you. And Dr. Dana Winters, kind of in a same light, what strategies are you taking? How can parents of non-Black children help young kids understand their role in this? What can you tell your children to do?
So I think that Jamal's suggestion about historically accurate conversations apply directly here also. And these are conversations that I just want to express that we all have the capacity to do this, and we all have the capacity to try. We might not be perfect from the beginning, and we don't have to be perfect to be helpful, but we have to do something and we have to try. And in these kinds of conversations, it's important to ask children what they may already know. What do they think? What have they heard? And also to confess sometimes that you don't know either, that you're in that journey with them. And simply saying, I don't know, might not be enough, but what about, I don't know, I'd like to find out, let's do it together. Let's learn about this together. Let's engage together. I have 2 young children myself. These have been conversations that we've had. My 10-year-old daughter when she was younger, challenged an adult over using the term skin-colored crayon, and she was, stood up for her friends who that skin-colored crayon absolutely did not apply to. Yet recently, when I told her what I was doing today, and I said I was going to talk with parents about talking with their children about racism, she said to me, "Mom, what's racism?" And I realized I'd never used the word, that we'd had these conversations, we'd talked, and we'd make sure that we were thinking about these things. We'd read books together, and I'd never used the word. And it's important for us to name it so that our children know what it is and can do and have these conversations with us in a trusting way and also with others. But I think the conversations are a part of it. They can't be the end of it. That attitudes around race and racism are not just taught, they're caught. And so if we're going to have these conversations with our children, we better be backing it up. We better be modeling what it looks like to have anti-racist action along with anti-racist conversations, which means the next time we're in the grocery store, how do we act on those conversations that we've had? So the conversations themselves are important, but we've got to have the openness and willingness to engage in action after that to model what that looks like for our children as well.
I think that's so important in reinforcing this idea of creating an anti-racist society. And I have a question from our audience. Emily and many others are asking, I think this falls in line with what we're just talking about. How do you coach your child to speak to other kids who've not been learning about race from their families? We see these moments, whether it's on the playground, at the grocery store, at a friend's house. How do you coach your child to speak to others?
I feel like we should engage in a giant game of rock, paper, scissors to see who gets to go first here. How do you engage in these conversations? So we want our children to be kind, and we want our children to be compassionate and be empathic with others. But there's also, you want our children to stand up for what they know is right. And so having conversations and being able to, on the playground, maybe stop something that isn't right. We want to empower our children to do that for one another as well. And so just because maybe other families aren't having these conversations, it does not mean that what children are learning from these conversations at home should be muted. It means that they need to talk and engage and interact with their peers in ways that advance this as well.
So actually, this leads me into a question that I have for you, Dr. Renee Wilson Simmons. There are acts of racism, whether blatant or it being a microaggression, that are seen or unseen that happen to Black children in their everyday experiences. Can you quickly define what a microaggression is and provide some examples, and then explain how these traumas impact children directly?
Oh, sure. So in terms of microaggressions, these are everyday verbal, nonverbal, environmental snubs or insults or slights, and whether they're intentional or unintentional in their effects, that communicate sort of a derogatory or a hostile message that targets a person or a group solely on their marginalized group membership. So some examples of that would be, so let's say in the classroom. So a teacher using inappropriate humor in the class that degrades students from a different group, or setting low expectations for students from particular groups. That is absolutely a microaggression. Or in this one, this complimenting Black students on their use of good English. So that, wow, you're really articulate, and saying that to a Black child is a condemnation of that child's race, because that statement means that the teacher thinks most Black people aren't articulate. And there are two that I've heard from parents' complaints, and one, and I'm sure many people will agree with this one, that when a teacher fails to learn how to pronounce a student's name, or continues to mispronounce it even after they've been corrected. And another one, and this is what sometimes people say, I don't know, what do you mean by environmental microaggression? So that would be having students engaged in required reading where the protagonists are always white. They're never Black. And so those are the kinds of things that end up making students feel uncomfortable in the class, makes them hesitant to answer questions or to even ask a question, make them feel that their contributions aren't or opinions aren't valid, or feeling inferior because of what they say, or feeling that they don't belong, which then they don't belong in the class, they don't belong in the school, they don't feel welcome. And when you ask what are some of the outcomes of that, I think truthfully, we know them all, that students don't want to go to school, that they end up not doing well, that they strike out in sometimes because of the way in which they're being treated. They get high levels of suspensions and expulsions, but it's not about them, it's about what's happened to them. And I would say there are, and you didn't ask me this, but I said, okay, you know what, I'm gonna make a list of the 3 things that, or specific recommendations that I believe that teachers should do. And the first one is, don't expect students to be experts on any experiences beyond their own. Like, they're not responsible to speak for their entire race or their entire group. And that is a complaint that we often hear. And then make it clear that you're invested in all students succeeding and that you believe that they can, by making it clear in the way you talk to each and every one of them. And then this last one, and I think it's so important, and it's when students have the courage, and it really takes courage, to let the teacher know that you've offended them by a remark or an action, please just listen to them and don't be defensive. Try to increase your understanding through dialogue. I think those 3 things are so very important, because I truly believe that some teachers, and I don't know what the percentage are, truly don't realize what they're doing. But we as parents have to call on schools to teach teachers about what microaggressions are, among many things, and how to avoid them.
Absolutely. And, I think, Jamal, I would love to hear from you on this, because I think you're right, Dr. Renee Wilson Simmons. Teachers play a large role, and parents play a large role in forming how schools operate within this. So Jamal, I'm wondering what role parents can play in school communities to ensure that anti-racism is a part of that school culture.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, it's about advocating. I think parents need to talk to teachers about it in parent-teacher conferences. And for us, we do home visits in the beginning of the year. They should share their feelings and share what they want their children to learn. I also think, and Dr. Winters hit it on the head, parents, if they want to be intentional about anti-racism, first they got to be the model. And so they need to model acceptance and tolerance of differences in their own lives. They need to show that. And I think they should be active in their schools so that they are exposing children to all different types of people that are different. So show their children, like, almost practice what they preach. So be a part of the school. Don't just advocate from far away, but go into the schools, read to all children, and be a part of that program.
Absolutely, thank you. I want to jump into a question from our audience really quickly, because I think this is relevant, because we see in schools, we see with certain families, we see this narrative around us right now. And I think this question is super important. Question is, how do we address families and children that assert the all lives matter response in context, in a counterpart to Black Lives Matter? How do we address that, or how do we combat that?
I would love to address this one. Only 'cause we had this exact conversation last night, and I think what people have to understand is that it's about acknowledgement, right? And when we're saying Black Lives Matter, we acknowledge. And I heard a guy say this, and this analogy hit it home for me. He said, if your spouse comes home and says, "I love you," and you respond saying, "Well, I love the entire world and everything in it," right? You didn't acknowledge your spouse, right? It's about a single acknowledgement back. We're not saying Black Lives Matter to say that nobody else matters, just to say acknowledge what we're talking about.
Great. I mean, I think you hit it right on the head. It's really important that phrase "All Lives Matter" is a direct opposition to Black Lives Matter. It does not move the narrative forward. It's actually violent against the narrative. So, thank you, Jamal. I wanna move to another question from the audience. Tracy says, we have a 3.5-year-old and a 10-month-old who haven't seen the news or know what's currently going on. How much should they share?
I would say, Tracy, it's important that we are good kind of mediators of media for our children. But I think it's also important to remember that this isn't something that is just new over the last 2 weeks either, that we can have conversations about race and racism, and we should be ongoingly. And it doesn't require us to share the latest media story with our children, but that these are conversations with a 3.5 and 10-month-old that you can have that are conversations maybe in generalities with maybe some specific messages, but it doesn't have to be focused on the specific occurrences of the last 2 weeks. My youngest walked out of a store today and saw a sign that said Black Lives Matter and turned around and said, "Mom, we talked about that." And so that part she gets, she's able to process that. But other parts of this discussion may not be appropriate for young children. And we need to think about what's appropriate as their mom, Tracy, you know them best. And so it's knowing your children and knowing how important this conversation is to start with them, and how the best way and the best entry point into that could be.
And I would just like to add to that and to say that I think there are so many parents who want to talk about these issues, who want to talk about racism and discrimination and being anti-racist, but they don't feel like they're experts on it. And I don't know how many people actually do feel like they're experts, maybe a few experts, but for parents, I just highly recommend that there is so much out there that's from credible organizations and long-standing and useful websites and publications that parents need to search out and look for what could be developmentally appropriate materials, guidance that they can use with their children. I mean, we're just not experts. So it makes sense to do that. And I believe one of the resources that are going to be available are a list of the kinds of age appropriate materials that parents can use. I know that our foundation began developing one. We're just about finished with it. And we categorize them by age and explain what we mean by age appropriate. I mean, and it's not just about chronological age, because we know that sometimes our children aren't at the developmental stage to talk about some things with them, but perhaps others. So parents are the best judge of what is developmentally appropriate, but they can look to sort of for infants and toddlers, sort of board books. And there are many of them. A is for Activists is a board book that's a great one for a baby to 3 years old, because you can just read it to the child. The child doesn't have to read, or whoever you are, that's sort of a rhythmic board book about acknowledging the commonality around all of us. So you can look by age range and by style to find the kinds of resources that are going to help you, because it is hard to try to figure it out on your own.
Dr. Renee Wilson Simmons, I think you brought up a really good point about the developmental age. We have a question from Hillary, wondering about children with severe behavioral challenges or that may be on the spectrum, ODD, ADHD. Do you have any suggestions on having conversations in adaptable ways for kids that are experiencing that?
I don't have experience in that area, but I know that the American Psychological Association, I want to say in 2017, created a toolkit for parents to talk about the ways in which you can engage in those types of conversations, and when there are sort of developmental delays or issues, and then they point you to other resources. So I highly recommend it.
Thank you. We're about a midway point in our conversation. I wanted to take a moment to review our community guidelines for those that might just be joining us. We've been having a really great conversation. I want you to take a look at these community guidelines you'll see on the screen. Now remember, we are asking everyone to please respect these community guidelines because this is an important conversation for everyone. Remember that racism will not be tolerated. We're asking folks to model empathy, to focus on their own learning and their own parenting styles, and please be open to new ideas. So again, if we find, myself, my friends, my panelists find that there are folks being disrespectful in the chat, you will be blocked from that chat. So please keep that in mind. So moving through our second, kind of like our second half of this conversation, I want to get into a clip that we have from Fred Rogers. And this is a clip that a lot of people remember. I'll get into it a little bit after. Let's take a look.
Cool water on a hot day.
Well, thank you for your refreshments.
Oh, I'm glad you like it. You're welcome, Officer Clemens.
Shall we turn this off?
Is that enough?
Oh, that's fine. Well, that was so enjoyable. I'm sorry I couldn't stay longer.
Well, I know how busy you are. But sometimes just a minute like this will really make a difference.
There, that one's dry. And now, that one. Thank you. Who can put your hand in my hand and be ready to feel all safe and strong? You're a child, so you can do it. Children do it all life long. There we are.
You have great boots to fill, Officer Clemens.
Well,
You
thank you
fill
very
them
much.
well. Thanks
Thank you.
for stopping by.
So long.
Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Many people remember this iconic moment from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood when Fred shared a pool with Officer Clemens. In fact, I've seen it resurfacing to this day. So, you know, now with the spotlight on historic and sustained excessive police brutality, Dr. Winters, I'm asking this question to you. Do you think this is still relevant? How do we reassess this moment? And like, you know, what language can we use? Just kind of a slurry of questions. I'll kick it off to you.
Sure, thanks, Will. So I think it's important to put this clip in context. This clip aired, it would have been in May, early May of 1969. And this was about almost the 20th episode where we saw Officer Clemens. Officer Clemens was in both the neighborhood and the neighborhood of make-believe. And this particular clip was in response to circumstances around desegregation of public pools at the time. So seeing them share a pool was a huge part of this clip, and sharing the water, sharing the towel. I think that there's two things that we can continue to think about with this clip. I think the first is the importance of representation within this clip. So Officer Clemens is seen in this clip as a police officer. There are times throughout Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood when he is not in his police uniform. But what Fred may have been trying to show here, and what's important about this clip, is that we see Francois Clemens as more than just one thing, that we are able to see him as the amazing singer that he is, that we see him in uniform, that we see him in the pool as a friend, and on and on. And so the representation is important, not just for young Black children to be able to see a Black police officer, but also for young children who aren't Black to see maybe the world in a way that if they don't see it outside their window, a world that should be in an acknowledgement of all of us as more than one thing. But also that the lasting thinking about this clip is in the discussions that come from it too. I teach a course at the college where we spend almost 3 weeks talking about this clip, and not talking about it in terms of how we transport it to now, but talking about it in terms of how we can learn from it and apply what we've learned in those philosophies to now. Because we know when it comes to media, the most important conversations happen when the TV's turned off. And what are those drivers of conversation that we can get from seeing a clip like this, even if we see it today, that same driver of communication is there.
Absolutely. I think for me, this is a really powerful clip because right now we're seeing police brutality at the forefront of the news of our conversations. And when I think about young children, I think that I see children idolize police officers all the time, on the train set, in playing games. And we have a question. We have a question from, where'd it go? Our friend Amy, having conversations about anti-racism and being an ally are a lot easier right now than conversations about police brutality. So any tips on having that conversation with children from any of you?
Mhm.
So I think the conversation around more than one thing sometimes can work both directions. So it's dangerous for us to generalize a population in good ways and in bad ways. And so being clear that there are people in the world who are good and there are people in the world who do bad things, and understanding what that means may be an entry point into that discussion. And there's such a fine line between wanting children to feel safe and wanting children to be aware also of some of the things that may not always be safe. I think that, as I said before, the representation in this clip is important, but that is also a representation in terms of a conversation starter. It can't be all there is.
In its entirety, absolutely. I want to take a moment. I'm seeing that in the chat box. Friends, can we pull up those community guidelines one more time as we move into our final 15 minutes of our conversation? We are asking folks, this is an open conversation. This is a space where we are sharing and learning, and disrespecting our community guidelines will not be tolerated. Please remember, we're blocking all racism, we're modeling empathy, and specifically, we're asking our folks that are joining us today to focus on your own learning and your own parenting styles. What works for one family doesn't work for all families, so please be mindful to focus on your own learning today. We're asking you that. And remember to be open to your new ideas. Thank you for pulling those up again. I want to move into some final audience questions. We have here from Snowlight, can we please address how promoting color blindness can be damaging when attempting to be anti-racist?
Yeah, the whole issue of color blindness and saying that you don't see race is cutting off the conversation about race. and I don't want to say it's a cop out, or because you may truly believe that you're at a point where race is not something you see. But if that's really true, well, you're in the minority. And so we can't accept I don't see race, because that really cuts off the conversation about what happens to all of us because people do see race. And there's some interesting writing about colorblindness and the dangers of saying that you're colorblind that I think people need to be aware of, because we have to have these conversations. And if we say we don't see it, then we can't just talk about it.
Absolutely. I think you hit it right on the head. The idea around colorblindness is it devalues and illegitimate, you know the word I'm saying.
Yeah, illegitimate.
Thank you. The experience of a person of color, specifically Black people. I think it's important to really recognize that Black people and people of color don't have an option to not recognize or see color. Those things are imposed upon us and imposed upon children. So the narrative of being colorblind is truly violent against Black lives and Black children because of the things that they experience every day.
Yeah.
I have another question from our audience from Ali Schmidt. How do you teach a 5-year-old who lives in a mostly white community about race when it's something that he rarely sees? We want to do it correctly, but we aren't sure how to do it well.
Well, I would say, I mean, a model that we use in my organization, we say parenting is about trial and error. I don't know if there's one perfect way to do that, but I think the first video that we watched is an excellent video. And that situation has been replicated over and over again. There's some classrooms that do it with kind of bracelets now, so maybe not as much as like a collar around children, that, but with bracelets. And they say like this color bracelet can't use the bathroom at this time, or this color bracelet has to use the water fountain down in the hall. They do this to just help children to understand what, not even racism, but to understand what inequality means, period. Like starting there with the concept of inequality. I think racism is a concept that 5-year-olds will learn later in time and as they see it, but you can start to talk about some of the concepts like what inequality means, period, and then they can use that concept to think about it at a later point in time.
And I may sound like a broken record, although how many people use records anymore, but I may just sound like I'm repeating myself, because I truly believe we have to look to people who can provide us with guidance that will truly help us. And so I highly recommend a book entitled Raising White Kids, Bringing Up Children in a Racially Unjust America. And it was published last year. And it was written by a university professor whose work focuses on racial justice and white anti-racism. And it offers really age-appropriate insights for teaching children how to address racism when they encounter it, and answers to difficult questions that children may pose about how, and then how to help children be mindful of the racism and their own identity and the role that they can play in speaking up when things are unjust. And I think it's so important. And I want to go back just for a minute to the class divided about what that teacher did, because those kids, all white kids in Iowa, in a community that was all white. And but we know those children are citizens of the world. And by that, I mean, they're going to leave that all white or almost all white community and that family and those friends and go out into the world. And unless they've had the opportunity to understand what it means to be racist and understand what it means for there to be justice for all, then they go out in the world and they're going to have an impact, but that impact isn't going to be what we want. So and we really have to find ways to acknowledge it. And I appreciate that there are white parents and white families who really want to do it. And we want them to do it right and to look to those who can provide some guidance.
I think one thing I would add also is to not be afraid to engage with the history, to be able to, until maybe it's not something you've engaged with before as a parent, to engage with your child around history, and not history from a school textbook, I would say, but history written from the perspective of the Black community, to be able to help to, you know, if you're growing up in an entire white community, that to be able to see beyond those walls and learn the historical backing of why this is so important to be thinking about too.
I love that. Thank all of you. Dr. Winters, we have a question specifically for you from Sarah. How did you answer the question from your child, what is racism? Sarah's 8-year-old asked her the same question last night.
So once I had realized that I'd never said the word out loud to my 10-year-old and chastised myself for a moment on that, I explained to her that racism is, you know, in terms she can understand, is treating people poorly and treating people badly because of the color of their skin. And then I went on to talk with her about why it's important to think about this within who currently has power within our country. Because her first question to me was, does this happen to everyone? And I thought that it was important to talk with her about specific racism against Black people, so that she understood, or could at least start to think about, that that racism has this inherent power to it, and that those who have power inflicting that, treating people poorly because of the color of their skin, was what I was talking about. And we had conversation about that. And then I left it pretty open and asked her to tell me what she thought and what she had seen, what she had noticed in the world, and continue to answer her questions as best as I could.
Thank you for sharing that. I have a question from Ronla. For children of color, how do we instill pride in them in the face of discrimination and all that's going on in our country right now?
And I think a way you do that is around the kinds of information you share, the stories that you engage in with them about their culture, about their people, and also about the ways in which we've persevered. So, you know, it's not a victim story, you know, it's a victory story, but it's so many multi-layered stories that we can tell to our children, and we can learn along the way, so that they build the kind of strong racial identity that enables them to sort of withstand the slings and arrows that come with microaggressions and racism. So I think knowing who you are is a key to that.
Yeah, Dr. Wilson Simmons, I totally agree. Perseverance, I think, is the key word there. Our history, a lot of stories about African Americans is built on perseverance. So I think we try to instill that in our children. And it's like you said, not just talking about stories of death and stories that you know have caused pain, but also talking about how we succeeded in the face of that. The other thing, one of my favorite books growing up was Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye. And as I think about that book and what I do for my Black daughters, I mean, we buy them a lot of toys and things that look like them. So we instill pride in also showing them through Black princesses, through Black Disney movies and all that as well, that, you know, that African Americans are just as equal. And so we try to instill that in them with conversations as well as through support and through, like I said, dolls and books and everything that mirrors them.
But I just want to add, so when I said persevere, it's not to suggest that we're persevered and we're going to continue to persevere and we're going to struggle and we'll continue to struggle. But this is the story of where we've been and where we're going, and where we're going is someplace different. And it's better. And it's not just better for us, it's better for everyone.
That's exactly right. And being Pittsburgh proud, I want to point out instilling pride. There's a program out of the University of Pittsburgh called Pride. It's positive racial identity in early education, led by Dr. Aisha White and Medina Jackson. There are tons of great resources there on how to instill pride in Black children. So I definitely suggest checking that out. So we're about 5 minutes to our end. I want to ask each of you to share some thoughts about language that parents can use right now to talk about their kids. So just some closing remarks, your thoughts, and any tips on language for parents. Jamal?
Yeah, I was thinking. I mean, I think we've covered a lot. I think using historical facts and language from history of things that have happened. So talking about slavery, using the word racism, I think that that's super important. And then into where this conversation has gone, I think thinking about self-worth and self-care and mental health and those type of words are also words that should be used. You know, we should love ourselves. We should continue to build up our families, and we should continue to support each other.
And I want to answer it a different way, just slightly different way, about the important role that parents play in all of this. And we know that children do better when families do better. And often families and parents have been through so much in terms of the racism and the hatred they've endured that they sometimes have a hard time talking about it at all. And that means they need some help first. Maybe they just aren't prepared to have these kind of conversations until they get the support they need to help them work through the kinds of trauma they've experienced, or the generational trauma that their parents and grandparents have experienced, that has become part of them and makes them difficult for them to do the work with their children that they need to do. So we've got to help the parents address their issues often before they can work with their children in the ways that they would really want to.
I agree with Dr. Wilson Simmons. It's so important. And it's also, I think I mentioned this earlier, a process that to engage in alongside children, also to be able to say, I don't know, let's figure it out together. Let's think about this together. As far as specific language, naming what it is, because when they leave your home, they're going to hear the words that are out there. So hearing them first from your mouth can make those conversations a lot easier. Racism, privilege, bias, talk about it. And the self-reflection of what that means for you and what that means for people close to you is a good starting point from your own experience. Sharing your history, whether that history is one that you'd like to change or not, is important, especially for white parents to, as children age, being able to say, I was a problem for this, and here's what I've learned, and here's how I've changed, and showing that capacity to change is possible. And being as open and honest as you possibly can be with children. They're gonna know if you're not, but also that's the respect that these conversations deserve. And again, taking it outside of just words, being able to model and being able to walk the talk that you've been having. outside of your home and outside of these conversations is so very important too.
I second everything you said.
Absolutely. Thank each of you so much. Thank you 1,000 times. This conversation is so meaningful. And I want to thank our audience for making space and time for just that. I want to close with a brief quote from Fred Rogers. Anyone who does anything to help a child in their life is a hero to me. And I'm asking you all to join people like me all over the world in being heroes for all of our kids. It's our responsibility to have these conversations and hold space to acknowledge Black lives and children to shape a better future for everyone. So remember, when you leave here, please take direct action. Talk to your kids about racism, about race, police brutality, privilege, all these words that we've said today. I want to give a special thank you to PBS for this platform and the space to acknowledge Black lives and move this conversation forward. We'll see you again sometime soon. And thanks again, and have a great rest of your day.